7 days after my wife's funeral, I spent in silence, as if the house itself had been holding its breath. But when I heard my son's footsteps in the hallway, I understood. He hadn't come for memories. His eyes were fixed on the jewelry box, as if his whole life depended on what was inside it. He didn't know that the real treasures she left behind were hidden somewhere else entirely. I said nothing, because that silence was stronger than any lock. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name was Walter Hayton. I was 75 years old the morning the light struck the living room wall and turned every family photograph into a silent witness. I had spent most of my life as a bank accountant in Dayton, Ohio. Numbers had always made sense to me. Clear, precise, never cruel unless mishandled. They didn't lie, they didn't change tone, and they never raised their voice. After I retired, I didn't quite know what to do with the part of me that had lived on balance sheets and interest reports. I started tracking things at home. When I last changed the furnace filter, the average water bill for February, the price of bread each year since 1996. It wasn't about obsession, it was about rhythm. The wall above the couch held 27 frames. I had measured the distances between them using a level and a ruler. My late wife, Marlene, once called it the museum wall. That was back when she was still amused by my need for order. Now the photographs stared back at me. Birthdays, fishing trips, a barbecue where my son held a sparkler like a sword. One photo showed Marlene in a yellow windbreaker, laughing with her head tilted back slightly, the way she always did when the joke was funnier than expected. Another showed my son as a teenager in a cap and gown, smiling in a way that seemed less genuine now that I knew what that smile later turned into. That morning, I didn't make coffee. I sat instead in the quiet and let the furnace hum through the floor vents. I watched as dust swirled in the beam of sunlight crossing the room. It was the 7th day since we buried her. The food from neighbors had stopped arriving, the phone calls had grown shorter, and the house had begun to settle back into a silence that felt more permanent than comforting. I hadn't moved any of her things. Her coat still hung by the door. Her slippers still sat beneath the bench in the foyer, toes slightly turned inward, like she'd be back to wear them. I couldn't bring myself to vacuum the carpet where her walker had left faint grooves. I stood up and approached the wall. The photographs had gathered a thin layer of dust. I fetched the soft brush she used to clean the piano keys and began moving it slowly across the frames. The bristles made a quiet sound, almost reverent, as they touched the glass. I hadn't played a note on that piano since she passed. It didn't feel right. Music had always belonged to her side of the house. I just listened. I always just listened. There was one frame that always tilted, no matter how often I fixed it. The one from our 25th anniversary trip to Lake Erie. We had asked a stranger to take the photo. Marlene's eyes were half closed from the sun, and I was holding her hand with an awkward stiffness. Still, it was my favorite. It captured something real. Our unease, our loyalty, the years between us like the water behind us in the picture. The frame never sat straight. I had rewired it 3 times, replaced the nail, even used a spirit level. It insisted on leaning, and eventually, I let it. Some things prefer to remain imperfect. The photo of our son as a child was different. In it, he stood beside a model rocket, beaming, holding up a ribbon from a school science fair. He used to believe in things back then. He used to run into the house with muddy sneakers and a fistful of dandelions for his mother. I wondered where that boy had gone. I wondered how the years had folded him into a man who now spoke in brief sentences and looked past me like I was a chair someone forgot to move. I noticed that the sunlight now hit the photograph of Marlene in a way that made the glass glimmer. Her eyes in the image seemed alive again. I reached out and touched the frame. The warmth of the sunlight had passed into the wood. I stood like that for several minutes, hand on the photograph, trying to remember what her voice sounded like when she said my name without disappointment behind it. It was getting harder. There was a cardboard box in the closet where I kept the original copies of those photographs. I used to think I might digitize them one day, scan them into folders, organize them by year and location. I never did. The box remained untouched, its contents curling slowly with time. I didn't want to see them out of sequence, didn't want to strip them of their weight. Something about paper held memories in a way that pixels never could. I walked back to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. The glass had a chip on the rim. She always said we should throw it away, but I never listened. I set it down on the same coaster my son made in 3rd grade, 4 popsicle sticks glued together with lumpy enthusiasm. One corner had broken off years ago, and I had sanded it smooth. That imperfection made it seem more honest, more mine. As I sipped the water, my eyes wandered to the sideboard, where a manila envelope sat untouched. It had the funeral home's logo in the top left corner. I hadn't opened it. I knew what it contained: thank you forms, notes on grief, options for urns or memorial plaques. I didn't need their instructions. Grief didn't fit in a trifold pamphlet. It didn't have steps or conclusions. It just spread. Quiet, persistent, invisible as mold. I returned to the living room and resumed my seat. From that angle I could see my reflection in the frames. An old man, hunched, wrapped in a cardigan too big for him, staring at shadows of people who no longer lived in the present. I tried not to resent the stillness. I tried not to speak to the house as if it could answer. At some point I rose and opened the closet door in the hallway. Her winter coat still hung there, soft and green, with a pair of gloves folded into the sleeves. I reached into the pocket and pulled out a tissue. It had her perfume still clinging to it. I didn't put it back. I spent the rest of the morning realigning frames, brushing off corners, and adjusting the light bulbs to a softer hue. These were things no one noticed, but she would have. She always noticed the small touches. She called them signs of care. I had never been good at saying the right things, but I knew how to keep a space from falling apart. Before noon, I stood in front of the photograph from our last Thanksgiving together. We were seated at opposite ends of the table, smiling. She had made her cranberry sauce from scratch, even though I told her the store-bought one tasted just the same. I remember now that it didn't. I walked to the window. Outside, the street was quiet. The neighbor's flag flapped gently in the breeze. I thought about going outside, maybe walking to the mailbox or trimming the hedges, but I stayed where I was. The light had shifted again, and the shadow over the photographs was growing longer. By evening, I lit the lamp beside the couch and watched how its glow fell across the frames. The faces softened under it. The smiles looked kinder, the eyes less tired. I moved one photo half an inch to the right and then stepped back. Everything felt almost in balance. I sat down again, pulled the wool throw over my knees, and closed my eyes. The house hummed quietly. The wall stood steady. And in that stillness, I understood what it meant to carry a life. Not in grand gestures or final words, but in the quiet maintenance of memory. In the way a man brushes dust from glass and leaves the crooked frame just as it is. I woke up before the alarm, not that I had set one. Habit did it for me. The internal clock of a man who spent decades rising at 6:30 to beat traffic and drink his coffee before anyone else. I stayed in bed for a few minutes, listening to the silence. There were no footsteps in the hallway, no faint clatter from the kitchen, no cabinet doors being opened and shut with the rhythm of morning. I stared at the ceiling until the shadows shifted enough to tell me the sun had begun its slow climb. Then I turned my head to the right. Her side of the bed remained untouched. The pillow still held the faintest impression of her head, though I had not dared press mine against it. The blankets on her side were smooth, just as I had left them that night weeks ago when the ambulance took her away. I had not folded them back. I had not tucked them in. I left them as they were, out of respect, or maybe denial. The weight of her absence lay heavier than any comforter. I sat up slowly and swung my legs over the side of the bed. My slippers waited where they always did, aligned neatly beside the dresser. She used to joke about my need for symmetry, how I could spot an uneven painting across the room, but couldn't find the ketchup in the fridge. I slid my feet in and stood. The floor was colder than I expected. The bedroom was still full of her. Her perfume lingered faintly in the air, mixed with the more neutral scent of old wood and carpet. The curtains remained half-drawn, the way she preferred them. Just enough light to read by, not enough to fade the fabric. I moved across the room with the caution of someone walking through a memory, afraid that any sudden motion might erase what was left. I stopped in front of the closet. It was a large one, deep and dark, and still organized in the way only she understood. She had divided it years ago, her side on the left, mine on the right. My side was sparse: 3 dress shirts, 2 pairs of slacks, a couple of sweaters, a sport coat for church, and the navy suit I wore to retirements, weddings, and, most recently, her funeral. Her side, in contrast, was a cascade of color and fabric. Scarves hung like ribbons of air. Blouses were arranged by sleeve length. Skirts and dresses moved gently, even without a breeze, as if stirred by the echo of her presence. I opened the door. The scent hit me first. Lavender and cedar. She always kept those little sachets tucked into her drawers and hanging from the closet rod. She said it made the clothes smell like care. I took one deep breath, and it nearly buckled my knees. It wasn't just the smell. It was what it meant. The smell said she had been here. The smell said she had planned to come back. I reached out and ran my fingers along the fabrics. There was the brown cardigan she wore every fall, the one with the loose button she refused to replace. Next to it was the blue dress she had worn to our grandson's christening, a small snag in the hem where her bracelet had caught. Her winter coat still had a tissue in the pocket. I touched it. It crinkled faintly, and I pulled my hand back like I'd touched a nerve. On the top shelf were the boxes she never let me throw away. Shoe boxes mostly, neatly labeled with masking tape. Easter decor, scarves, mittens, keepsakes. I didn't open them. I wasn't ready. I wasn't sure if I ever would be. Below, on the floor of the closet, sat her worn leather flats and a pair of house slippers I had bought her 2 Christmases ago. The tag was still faintly visible on one of the soles. She had called them too soft to wear, and placed them in the closet as if saving them for a better version of herself. She always did that, saved the best things for later. The good towels, the expensive tea, the bottle of wine from our anniversary trip that we never opened. I sat down on the edge of the bed, facing the open closet. It looked like she had just stepped out for a moment, as if she'd returned from the hallway holding a magazine or a cup of tea, as if her slippers were paused mid-motion, waiting to resume their path. I stared at her clothes until my vision blurred. Eventually I stood and reached for the hangers. My hands hovered there, undecided. I didn't know if I was supposed to start clearing it. Was there a timetable for grief? Some manual I had missed that dictated when to fold away what's left behind? I couldn't do it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I spotted the shoebox she had once called my little time machine. It was covered in stickers, faded and peeling. I had seen her opening it occasionally, usually on rainy days, sometimes around anniversaries. She never told me what was inside. I never asked. It felt like a private conversation between her and the past. I took it down and sat with it on my lap. My fingers traced the lid. I could feel the texture of tape along the edges. I didn't open it. I set it beside me on the bed and just sat there, listening to the silence of the room. I thought about the years she spent folding my clothes, picking out ties, reminding me gently when socks didn't match. I remembered how she would iron her blouses the night before work, humming quietly to herself. How she'd stand in front of the mirror adjusting a scarf until it felt just right. That mirror was still there, above her dresser. Her brush lay beside it, still holding strands of silver hair. Her lipstick cap was slightly ajar. Her wedding ring rested in the small ceramic dish she used for jewelry she didn't want to wear to sleep. I stared at it. The ring I had slipped onto her finger 49 years ago, in a church filled with hopeful faces and flower petals that stuck to my shoes. I didn't touch the ring. I returned to the closet and stood again at the threshold. I ran my hand gently across the hanging clothes. The fabrics whispered against one another. My breath caught. I felt a tightening in my chest that had nothing to do with age. It was the quiet ache of a man standing in a space built for two, now echoing with one. I turned off the light in the closet but left the door open. I wanted to see it from the bed. I didn't want to close her away. I didn't want to treat her memory like a storage item to be packed up and moved on from. That night, I lay in bed longer than usual. I faced her side. I looked toward the closet, toward the space where her presence still clung like dust to the edges of the wood. And I waited. For what? I wasn't sure. A sound. A scent. A shadow that might move if I blinked slowly enough. But nothing came. Only the quiet. Only the clothes. And the knowing that I was now the only keeper of her closet, her life, and everything she chose to leave behind in silence. I spent the morning moving slowly through the house like I was walking underwater. Everything felt heavier since the funeral, and I no longer moved with purpose, but with caution. There was no rush, no schedule, no meetings or appointments, only silence that waited at every turn, patient and unwavering. After breakfast, I walked into the bedroom, still unsure why I had come, and stood at the foot of the bed. The light from the window cast soft lines across the comforter, and in that hush, I noticed something I had overlooked for days. The jewelry box on Marlene's dresser. It was small and wooden, dark with age and handling, and about the size of a hardcover book. She had kept it since before we were married. I remember the day she bought it from a flea market in Cincinnati. She bargained for it with a laugh and a wink and told me, "This will be for the things I want to remember." Back then, I hadn't understood what she meant, but over the years, the box grew heavier with meaning. She never let anyone else open it, not even me. When I asked what was inside, she only smiled and said it held little pieces of her. I approached the dresser slowly. Her mirror still held smudges from her fingertips. Her brush was exactly where she had left it. A small dish next to the jewelry box contained loose buttons, a safety pin, and a pair of earrings with one missing its match. The box itself sat in the center of the dresser like an anchor, unmoved, untouched. I stared at it for a long while before sitting down on the edge of the bed. I didn't open it right away. There was something about the act that felt invasive, even now. I knew she was gone. I had buried her with my own hands folded across my lap, watching the casket descend like a stone into the ground. But this box still belonged to her. It still carried her warmth. Her fingerprints were still pressed into the grain. The brass hinge still clicked in that soft way it had always done when she opened it in secret. I could almost hear it. Eventually, I reached for it. My fingers hovered over the lid. The wood was cool to the touch, smooth from years of her handling it. There were scratches along the sides where her rings must have nicked the surface as she closed it carelessly in a hurry. I traced those marks, feeling each tiny groove like a piece of her story. Then I lifted the lid. Inside, the scent of rose and cedar greeted me, soft and immediate. The first layer held what I expected, jewelry neatly arranged. Her wedding band rested in the center, next to the necklace I had given her for our 35th anniversary. I remembered how long I had saved for that necklace, How she had cried when she saw the little velvet box, and how she had worn it only once a year after that, afraid to lose it. She had always treated beautiful things as if they were borrowed. There were earrings she wore to church, some costume jewelry from her younger days, and a small gold locket I hadn't seen in years. I opened it and found a photograph folded into its oval frame, our son as a toddler, face sticky with jam, smiling like the world had never told him no. On the other side was a picture of me, younger, leaner, eyes less tired. I couldn't remember when she had taken it. I didn't even know it existed. Beneath the top tray was a second compartment, one I had never seen her open. I lifted the tray carefully and found letters, dozens of them. Some were in envelopes, others loose, folded with care. They were addressed in her handwriting, to me. My breath caught. I picked up the top one and held it for a moment, unsure if I could read it. Then I unfolded the paper. Her handwriting was familiar, even now. Looped, precise, always slightly slanted to the right. She had dated the letter 5 years ago. It began simply, "Walter, if you're reading this, then I'm not there." I paused, hands trembling. She had written letters knowing I would find them after she was gone. I read on. She spoke about small things. How she loved watching me make coffee every morning, how she noticed I always stood to the left of the sink, how I hummed old songs without realizing. She thanked me for the quiet, for never needing loud love to make her feel secure. She wrote about the house, how she had chosen the paint in the hallway, because it reminded her of the day we brought our son home from the hospital. She told me not to feel guilty. She told me grief was not an enemy, just an echo. She asked me to remember her without freezing her in place. "Let me move through the house with you," she wrote. Not as a shadow, as a rhythm. I couldn't keep reading. I folded the letter and placed it back in the box, my eyes burning. I looked down at the pile. How many were there? 12? 2? I didn't count. Each one was a version of her voice, still living in ink. I knew they weren't meant to be read all at once. I would save them, one for each week, maybe each month, maybe whenever I felt the silence growing too loud. I returned the tray of jewelry and closed the lid slowly. The box was heavier now, but not with gold or silver. It carried her breath, her words, her invisible presence. I set it back on the dresser in the exact place I had found it. The mirror reflected my face, and I didn't look away. I saw the man she had written to, the quiet man, the patient one, the one who had always underestimated how deeply she watched. I stood there for a while, not moving. The bedroom felt warmer, though the heat hadn't come on. I opened the drawer where she kept her scarves and pulled out the green one she always wore in spring. I held it to my face and closed my eyes. The scent was faint, but still there. I folded it carefully and placed it in my lap. Later that day, I walked past the dresser again and paused. The box sat there like it had for decades, but now it looked different. Not just a container for trinkets, but a vault of the intangible. The unseen weight of love stored not in the obvious places, but in the ones you didn't think to check until you had to. I didn't tell anyone about the letters. I didn't plan to. Some inheritances aren't meant to be shared. Some are meant to be felt in private, in the hush between moments, in the space between a man and the dresser where the woman he loved left behind a map of her heart, one page at a time. The house changed its shape after the funeral. It didn't shift its walls or furniture, but something in its weight became heavier. Everything stayed where it was. Pillows still fluffed, chairs still angled toward the television, the rug still bunched near the edge of the hallway. But the silence grew thicker, more physical, like a layer of fog that refused to lift. I moved through it slowly, as though each step stirred old air that had forgotten how to circulate without her breathing it in first. It had been 1 full week since I stood in the rain, listening to dirt fall onto the casket, and nothing in me had reset. People always talked about time as a healer, but I didn't feel healed. I didn't feel anything at all, which was worse. The day after the burial, I thought maybe the numbness would fade. It didn't. It hardened. It settled into my skin like cold. Each morning, I woke without an alarm and lay in bed staring at the ceiling. I stopped turning the television on. I didn't check the weather. I didn't read the paper. The world outside the windows might have changed. The trees might have lost their leaves. The birds might have returned. But I didn't look to verify it. The windows became picture frames. They showed me only what I already knew: stillness, and the fact that I was now the only moving thing in this house. I tried to eat at regular times. She would have wanted that. I made oatmeal on the stove, the way she used to, but I left out the cinnamon because I didn't trust myself not to cry when I smelled it. I made coffee, but drank only half a cup before pouring the rest down the sink. I couldn't taste anything. Food no longer seemed like a comfort, only an obligation, a task to prove that I was still functioning. I stopped answering the phone. After the first few days, people stopped calling anyway. The neighbors who had dropped off casseroles no longer rang the bell. They waved when I took the trash out, but their eyes held the cautious distance of those who don't know what to say to a man alone in grief. I didn't blame them. I barely knew what to say to myself. I spent hours sitting in the den, watching light move across the floor. It started near the east-facing window and slowly crept across the rug toward the bookshelf as the day passed. I followed it with my eyes like a sundial, measuring time not by minutes, but by inches of shifting brightness. I didn't turn on any lamps. I let the house dim naturally, welcoming the dusk as if it were someone who had earned their silence. On the second day, I noticed that the house creaked differently. The boards under the hallway floor made a softer sound, like they were hesitating before complaining. The bathroom faucet had a drip I'd never heard before. The refrigerator motor cycled louder, or perhaps I was just hearing things more clearly now that nothing else competed for attention. The silence made room for small sounds to speak. I walked through each room slowly, sometimes stopping in the doorway as if I were expecting her to look up and ask me what I needed. In the laundry room, I found one of her socks tucked behind the dryer. I sat on the floor and held it in my hand for over an hour. I couldn't explain why. It was just a sock, but it was warm with memory, even if the fibers had long cooled. I tried to dust the bookshelves on the third day. I got halfway through before stopping. My hand trembled too much. The books she had arranged by genre now looked like they were waiting for her hands, not mine. She had always remembered which ones we'd read together. Now I couldn't remember where we left off. The bookmarks stayed where she had put them, and I didn't dare move them forward. I walked past the closet door each night, always pausing, but never touching it. Her clothes still hung on their hangers, undisturbed. I didn't open it again. Not yet. The air inside that closet seemed like it had not been breathed since she left, and I wasn't ready to break that seal. I wasn't ready to let her scent fade. I feared that once it was gone, so would be another thread connecting her to this place. One afternoon, I tried to write a grocery list. It had been her job for 40 years, and even when she got sick, she insisted on doing it. I sat at the table with a pen and a notepad, but couldn't remember what I needed. My mind went blank. I ended up writing down things we used to buy, just to feel like I was completing a familiar task. Milk, bread, laundry detergent, eggs, apples. I didn't need half of it. I just wanted to see her handwriting again. Mine looked foreign on the page. I ventured into the backyard once during the week. The garden she loved had already started to wither with the season. The last of the marigolds leaned toward the ground, their heads heavy, their stems curling. I knelt down and pulled some of the dead leaves from the flower bed. The soil was damp beneath my hands. She would have worn gloves. I didn't. I let the dirt stay under my fingernails like a badge of penance. Each night, I sat in her chair by the window. I had never used it before. That corner had always belonged to her, a space for knitting, reading, watching birds in the feeder. I didn't sit in it to feel close to her. I sat in it because the room no longer made sense without her in that spot. The cushion was still sunken in the middle, shaped by her weight, and I settled into it without adjusting anything. The night noises were the worst. The tick of the wall clock sounded like footsteps. The pipes in the ceiling whispered like someone turning over in bed. I imagined her walking through the house, not as a ghost, but as a habit my mind refused to break. I kept waiting to hear her cough from the hallway, the kind she made when she wanted me to bring her tea, but didn't want to ask directly. I didn't sleep much. When I did, I dreamt of incomplete things, conversations that stopped mid-sentence, doorways I couldn't cross, tables set for two with no chairs. I woke up with a hollow in my chest and the taste of forgetting on my tongue. I started leaving the bedroom door open, as if I needed to hear something before it could vanish completely. I didn't cry, not the way people expect. There were no dramatic sobs or collapsed shoulders, just a slow erosion from the inside, a soft crumbling. My eyes would fill at unexpected moments, the way the lamp flickered when I turned it on, the creak of the mailbox, the sound of her name in my own head. The week passed in increments of silence. No music, no radio, no voice but my own, and even that one went unused. I hadn't spoken out loud in days. I realized I missed hearing my own name spoken with familiarity, not shouted from across the yard or printed on a bill, but said softly, as if it meant something. At the end of the 7th day, I sat in the dark with the lights off. The house had settled again. The air had grown still. I didn't feel healed. I didn't feel different. But I knew something had shifted. A week of silence had not restored me, but it had revealed the shape of the absence I now lived with. Not a whole exactly, but a presence in reverse. And in that stillness, I began to understand that grief was not waiting to be fixed. It was not a wound that could be stitched shut or a storm that would pass. It was a room I now lived in, and the silence was its furniture. I was learning how to sit in it without flinching. I was learning how to remain. It happened on the 8th day. The house had fallen into its rhythm of silence, and I had begun to move with the sluggish deliberateness of someone who no longer expected interruptions. I was in the kitchen when I heard it, the sound of tires on gravel, a car door opening, then closing too quickly. I knew that sound. It belonged to my son, David, not because of the model or the engine, but because of the pace, the briskness, the certainty, the intention behind the motion. I didn't rush to the window. I didn't need to see him to know it was him. My body already braced itself before my eyes confirmed it. I moved to the front room and stood behind the sheer curtain, watching as he walked up the path. He wore a dark jacket, and his hands were empty. He didn't pause at the steps. He didn't look at the flower bed or the small ceramic squirrel Marlene had placed near the porch light 20 years ago. He moved like a man arriving at a meeting, not a house. When the doorbell rang, it didn't echo. It landed flat in the hallway, as if the house itself had forgotten how to receive guests. I let it ring once more before opening the door. He offered a half smile, the kind that didn't reach the eyes. I stepped aside, and he entered without a word. No embrace, no hesitation. Just a brief glance toward the living room, then the hallway. He had aged. Lines along his mouth that hadn't been there last Christmas, a touch of gray above his ears. But his eyes were the same. Sharp, focused, a little too impatient. I knew that look. I had seen it on him as a teenager when he wanted the car keys. I had seen it when he waited for news about a job offer, a mortgage, a child's due date. It was a look that wanted something but didn't want to admit it. He sat down in the armchair across from the couch. I didn't sit. I stood with my hand resting on the edge of the doorway, waiting. He looked around the room as if he were trying to locate something specific. His eyes passed over the mantel, the end tables, the lamp, the framed photograph of his mother that I had moved to the center of the shelf just 2 days ago. He didn't linger on it. He cleared his throat. That was the signal, his way of transitioning from thought to speech. I could almost hear the gears turning. I watched his mouth form the beginning of a sentence, but instead of speaking, he adjusted the cuff of his sleeve. I waited. I had no need to fill the silence. I had lived with it for days, and it no longer frightened me. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured. Not soft, but careful. I heard the phrase, "just wanted to check in," followed by something about how you were holding up. I nodded. I didn't answer. He wasn't asking to hear. He was asking to say he asked. Then came the shift. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees, and looked toward the hallway. He asked if I still kept Mom's things in the bedroom. I said yes. He nodded, as if confirming something he already knew. He mentioned the jewelry box, the one on her dresser, said he remembered it from childhood, said she always kept nice things in there. I watched the way he avoided my eyes when he said nice things. His gaze stuck to the floor or the furniture, but not to me. I told him the box was still there. I said nothing more. He looked up at me then, studying my face. I knew he wanted permission, or at least a lack of resistance. I gave him neither. He stood up and walked toward the bedroom. I didn't follow. I stayed in the living room, staring at the photograph of Marlene. Her smile in that picture was different, genuine, unaware of being captured. She looked content, present, the kind of presence that didn't need an audience. I heard the soft click of the bedroom door opening, then the long pause, the creak of the floorboards near the dresser. Silence again. Then the familiar sound of a lid being opened, followed by the light clink of metal shifting inside velvet-lined compartments. He was going through it. The thought tightened something in my chest, but I didn't move. I didn't move because I knew that he wasn't looking for memories. He was looking for value, not the kind measured in sentiment, but in appraisals, in carats and resale. He didn't know about the letters. He didn't know what was underneath the second tray, and I didn't plan on telling him. After a few minutes, he returned. He walked back into the living room with his hands in his pockets, his eyes darting around. He said something vague, something about how she would have wanted things to be put to use. I nodded again, and again said nothing. He asked if I wanted to go through it with him. I declined. He offered a suggestion about sorting things next week. I didn't answer. He sat back down, tapped his fingers on the armrest, then asked about the garage, if I still kept the tools in the same place. I nodded. He asked about the shed, about the key, about the lawnmower, about the will. The last one hung in the air. I let him sit with it. Eventually, he mentioned that funerals were expensive, that things were tight lately, that maybe some of Mom's jewelry could help ease things with the kids, the house, the holidays. I said I understood, but I didn't say what I understood. He stood again, walked toward the door, said he'd be in touch, said he'd stop by again soon. I walked him to the porch. The sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the lawn. He looked around like he was assessing the property. I recognized the look, not as a son visiting a father, but as a man eyeing what might soon be his. He stepped off the porch and walked to his car. As he opened the door, he glanced back and said, "If there's anything you want to set aside, just let me know." I said I would, but I wouldn't. I stood on the porch long after his car disappeared down the road. The wind moved the leaves across the yard. A bird landed on the railing, then flew away. I turned and went back inside. The house seemed quieter now, but not empty. just full of things he didn't understand. The jewelry box was still in the bedroom. The letters were still untouched. The real inheritance had never been made of gold. And I was still here, watching, waiting, remembering, guarding what mattered, even if he never knew what that was. I heard the sound before I entered the room. It was faint, metallic, rhythmic, the sound of small objects brushing against one another in soft collisions, like distant wind chimes, muffled by walls and time. I knew instantly what it was. I knew that sound from years of watching her hands move through the jewelry box, from hearing her hum while choosing earrings for a dinner out, from seeing her fingers hesitate above a brooch as if waiting for it to speak. But it wasn't her in that room now. It was David. I stood in the hallway just outside the bedroom, one hand resting lightly on the doorframe. I didn't enter. I listened. The lid creaked on its hinge, the same soft sound it had made for decades. Then came the rustle of fingers shifting through compartments, the dull, padded thud of a tray being lifted, the sharper clink of chains unraveling, of rings colliding in their velvet corner. The box was open, and he was inside it. I had not given him permission, but I had not stopped him either. That was my mistake. Or maybe it was a choice, a kind of silent test, one I already knew the result of. He moved with intent. Not rough, but not gentle either. The sounds were efficient, impatient, searching. The kind of movement that had no reverence, only purpose. I could almost see him in my mind's eye, sitting on the edge of the bed, his shoulders hunched forward, hands quick and methodical, eyes narrowing when he found something shiny. I imagined his fingers lifting the silver locket she wore on our anniversary, the one she said made her feel elegant. I pictured him setting it aside, evaluating its weight, its resale potential, its place in his imagined tally of what Mom left behind. There was a silence then, a pause in the sounds. I imagined him holding something in his hand, examining it. Maybe the bracelet I gave her on our 10th Christmas, the one with the tiny star charm that used to catch the light at church. I had watched her twist that charm between her fingers whenever she was nervous. Now I imagined it lying flat in his palm, inert, unrecognized. Then the sounds resumed. Louder this time. Coins against coins, metal against wood. A sharper clatter of something dropped and quickly retrieved. The kind of sound that made the heart flinch, even if the object wasn't fragile. I tightened my grip on the doorframe and stepped back once, unsure if I wanted to interrupt or disappear. I went to the kitchen. I needed to put my hands on something real. I opened the drawer where we kept the dish towels and took one out, unfolded it, then folded it again. My fingers moved slowly, methodically, the way hers used to when she folded laundry. I stood there, towel in hand, staring at the sink. When the sounds in the bedroom stopped, the silence that followed was heavier than the one before. It was the silence of decision. The kind that precedes an action you can't take back. I waited, counted to 30, then walked slowly back toward the room. The door was ajar. He didn't hear me approach. He sat with the jewelry box open on his lap, a small pile forming beside him. Necklaces, rings, a few brooches, a watch. The kind of pile that had been sorted not by sentiment, but by price. His back was to me. He leaned forward slightly, his hand reaching for something inside the lower compartment. He found the wedding ring. He held it between his fingers and tilted it toward the light. It was simple, gold, slightly worn, engraved on the inside with the date of our wedding. I remembered the day we picked it out, how she had insisted on something plain. "It's not about the ring," she said. "It's about the hand wearing it." He turned the ring over once, twice, then placed it next to the others. Not in the center, not with care, just placed, like it was just another item in the collection. I didn't say a word. I watched from the doorway as he closed the lid halfway, then paused. His eyes scanned the room, maybe remembering where she used to sit, maybe looking for something else worth taking. He noticed the photo on the dresser, one of her alone, taken the summer before the illness. Her smile in it was soft, private, not meant for an audience. He looked at it for a second, then looked away. He stood and picked up the jewelry box. He didn't cradle it. He carried it like a briefcase. I moved to the side so he could see me. He startled, not in a dramatic way, but enough that his posture changed. He didn't expect to be seen. I didn't ask him what he was doing. I didn't demand he put anything back. I just stood there, still watching. He said something about sorting it all later. Said he was just trying to help. That it was time to start thinking about what to do with things. I nodded once. He brushed past me, box in hand. The metal inside it trembled again. A low, rattling hum, like bones in a wooden cage. Each step he took made the contents shift. I could hear them knocking against one another, the soft clink of memory being packed up for someone else's use. He left it on the dining room table. Said he'd go through it with me sometime this week. I didn't touch it. I left it where he placed it, lid closed, like a sealed argument waiting for the next round. After he left, I sat in the chair by the window and stared at the box. The room felt smaller with it there, not because of its size, but because of what it represented. It was no longer her jewelry box. It had become evidence, a container of betrayal, a list of items measured and found profitable, not meaningful, not irreplaceable, just available. I opened the lid again, slowly, carefully. The pieces had shifted in his hands, and now they lay in disarray. Her brooch was upside down. Her earrings were separated. The necklace with the tiny heart was tangled around her old charm bracelet. I didn't move them. I sat in silence, listening to the memory of the sounds, the scraping, the clinking, the breath between touches, the tremble of metal against metal. It echoed in my chest like a second heartbeat. I closed the lid gently. Then I picked up the box and carried it back to the bedroom. I placed it on her side of the dresser, exactly where it had always been. I stood there for a long time, staring at it. The air felt cold. My hands felt colder. And in that moment, I understood that not everything my son touched could be restored. But some things I could still protect. The day after David left the jewelry box on the dining room table, I found myself sitting across from it in the late afternoon light, staring at the closed lid as though it might open by itself and explain what had just happened. The house was quiet, but it wasn't the gentle silence I had grown used to. It was a tense kind of stillness, like the breath before a storm or the hesitation in a conversation that has turned toward something difficult. I didn't reach for the box. I just sat and watched it, the same way I would have watched a door I wasn't sure I wanted to open. I could still hear the way the metal had clinked when he carried it. That dry, unfeeling sound of rings and chains jostling against one another, no longer arranged by the hands that had once worn them, but simply gathered, collected. I imagined how Marlene would have reacted to seeing her life's keepsakes sifted through like clearance items. I knew she would have smiled politely and said nothing. She always had a quiet way of knowing more than she let on. But I also knew that deep inside, she would have mourned the loss, not of the objects, but of what they had meant. After a while, I got up and walked to the hall closet. On the top shelf, buried under a stack of folded linens, was a wooden box I hadn't touched in years. It was plain and unadorned, no brass hinges or velvet lining, just a lid that slid into place with a wooden groove and a faint squeak when you opened it too quickly. I had made it myself back in 1987, in the basement, on a Saturday when David was still in middle school. I had intended it to hold spare keys and household receipts, but over time, it became something else entirely. I brought the box to the living room and placed it on the coffee table next to Marlene's jewelry box. One looked like it belonged in a department store. The other looked like it belonged in a drawer no one opened. I slid the lid back and looked inside. Inside were objects that had no market value. There was a tiny ceramic elephant with a chipped ear. Marlene had won it at a county fair ring toss during our 3rd year of marriage. A ticket stub from a drive-in theater where we had taken David when he was 8. A metal thimble that had belonged to my mother, which Marlene kept even though she never sewed. A tiny matchbook with a restaurant logo from our anniversary trip to Boston. A wrinkled postcard I had never mailed, scribbled with "Thinking of you," and nothing else. None of it sparkled. None of it would be taken by a pawn shop or placed behind glass in a showcase. And yet each piece carried more weight than gold. They held something money couldn't touch. They held the shape of our lives, not as we displayed them, but as we lived them. There was a folded napkin from a diner where we had stopped during a rainstorm in '79. I had drawn a crooked heart on it with a blue pen. Marlene had slipped it into her purse without a word. I hadn't known she kept it. And yet here it was, faded and torn, still holding the shape of her fingers in its creases. I sat back and stared at the 2 boxes, one full of things people admired, the other full of things they forgot. And I felt for the first time since the funeral the difference between inheritance and memory. One could be measured, the other could only be felt. When David spoke about the jewelry, he used words like value and worth. He mentioned college savings, credit card debt, things that, in his world, had urgency and logic. And I didn't disagree with him. I knew the economy wasn't kind, and he had a family of his own. But what he didn't understand, what maybe he couldn't, was that some things were never meant to be turned into solutions. Some things were only meant to be held, remembered, and quietly returned to when the rest of the world became too loud. Marlene had understood this. She had kept a drawer full of useless items, receipts, paper clips, old birthday cards, that she never looked through, but never threw away. She called it her proof of life. I used to tease her about it, asking how many paper clips it took to prove someone existed. She'd smile and say, "Just one, if you hold it long enough." I closed the wooden box and set it on my lap. The grain was worn smooth where my fingers had brushed it over the years. I could still smell a trace of basement varnish and cedar. I held it for a long time, longer than I planned to, and let the weight of it settle into my legs. Later that evening, I walked into the bedroom and opened her nightstand drawer. It was exactly as she had left it. A half-used notepad with flowers printed on the border. A pair of reading glasses with a tiny crack in the arm. A tube of lip balm so worn down it barely turned. And beneath all that, a bundle of photographs wrapped in a rubber band. I hadn't seen these in years. They weren't the kind she framed. These were candid, slightly blurry, off-centered. Me mowing the lawn in a floppy hat. Her holding a melting popsicle next to David at the park. A photo of our old dog, Lucy, sleeping under the kitchen table. A photo of David asleep in the back seat during a road trip. A comic book spread open on his chest. A photo of Marlene in her robe, standing at the window, looking out. I carried the photos to the living room and placed them on the table next to both boxes. There was no symmetry, no curation, just a mess of memory spilling over wood and paper. I didn't arrange them. I let them rest where they fell. The jewelry still lay inside the velvet box, untouched since the day David had handled it. I didn't know what he planned to do with it, or when he might come back, but I knew one thing for certain. Whatever he took from that box, he'd leave empty-handed in another way. Because the things that mattered most weren't in that jewelry box. They were in the drawer she hadn't locked, in the notes she scribbled on shopping lists, in the pictures no one saw but her. They were in the weight of an old elephant figurine, in the smell of cedar, in the way a napkin folded 30 years ago could still bring tears to the eyes of a man who had lived a quiet life beside her. I sat back in my chair as the sun dipped low behind the backyard trees. The light softened until the room turned gold, then gray. I didn't turn on a lamp. I let the shadows fall. And I stayed there, surrounded by things you couldn't buy, couldn't sell, couldn't replace. Only remember. The house had a way of holding secrets gently, not in the dramatic sense of locked doors or hidden rooms, but in the quiet, almost reverent way it preserved the forgotten. It tucked memories into drawers, behind books, under old blankets, never to conceal, only to wait. And on that cold Thursday morning, I felt something waiting for me. I wasn't looking for anything. I had gone into the guest room only to change a light bulb. The one above the desk had been flickering for days, and I finally got tired of ignoring it. I climbed the step stool, twisted the old bulb free, and reached into the desk drawer to retrieve the new one I'd left there weeks ago. That's when I saw the envelope. It wasn't hidden. It sat right near the edge of the drawer, tucked beneath a folded dish towel. For some reason I couldn't explain. Cream-colored, unsealed, and slightly creased at the corners. My name was written on the front in Marlene's handwriting. Walter. That was all. No date, no message on the envelope itself. Just my name in blue ink, written with her favorite pen, the one with the floral barrel she kept in the kitchen drawer and always refused to replace, even when the clicker stuck. I held the envelope in my hand and stared at it for a long while. The paper was warm from the sunlight coming through the guest room window, but my fingers were cold. I didn't open it right away. My thumb brushed over the lettering, those rounded W's and careful T's, that slight upward tilt at the end, like she always left a little room at the top of every word. She used to say the space gave her thoughts somewhere to breathe. Eventually, I slid the paper from inside and unfolded it. Her handwriting filled the page. Not rushed or messy, but steady and graceful. The kind of handwriting that came from a time when people were taught to slow down, when every letter had a rhythm and purpose. I sat down in the chair by the window and began to read. She had written it months ago. The references gave it away. Mentions of a summer walk, of leaves not yet fallen, of a grocery list that included cherries and lemonade. She hadn't dated it, but I didn't need a timestamp. The words placed themselves in a season, and her voice, though silent, filled the room. She told me she had written several letters, that she wasn't sure when or if I'd find them. She said some were in obvious places, others not. She hoped I'd come across them slowly, over time. "I don't want you to miss me all at once," she wrote. "Let it happen like mist, not rain." She thanked me, not for anything grand, but for the ordinary things, for mowing the lawn when her allergies got worse, for bringing her tea at night, even when I didn't feel like getting up, for never making her feel small when her memory began to fail in little embarrassing ways. "You never corrected me in front of others," she wrote. "You let me keep my dignity. That is love." She confessed small fears, that she would become a burden, that I would feel more relief than grief when she was gone, that she had stayed too quiet about the things that truly mattered. She said she wished she had told me more often how safe I made her feel, how rare that was, how rare I was. I paused reading and looked out the window. The maple tree in the backyard had begun to shed its leaves. One fell slowly, spinning like a coin. I turned back to the letter. She wrote about our son. She said she hoped I'd be gentle with him, even if he wasn't gentle with me. That grief changed people. That disappointment came in many forms, and not all of them were easy to forgive. "Remember that he is your child, not your reflection," she wrote. "Love him, even when he doesn't look back the way you expect." I folded the letter and unfolded it again. I read it a second time, slower. Her voice in my head softened with each sentence. I could hear her pauses, her sighs, her hesitant laughter when writing something that felt too sentimental. She had always downplayed her own wisdom, but on this page, She let it pour. At the end, she wrote, "If you find this, you're still here. So keep going, Walter. Keep making the bed. Keep putting your shoes in the same place. Keep the windows clean. Grief is not a reason to forget how to live." There was no signature, just space. Her handwriting faded near the bottom, not from ink, but from intention. She had known when to stop. I sat there for a long time, holding that page. It weighed almost nothing, but in my hands, it was heavier than any book, heavier than the ring she left in the box, heavier than the silence that now filled every room. It carried a presence ink alone could not explain. I didn't place the letter in a frame. I didn't fold it into the back of a photo album or slip it into the box with the rest of her things. I kept it in my shirt pocket for the rest of the day, pulling it out again when the sun began to set, reading a few lines as the shadows climbed the walls. Later that night, I placed it in the drawer of my bedside table, not to hide it, but to be near it. It was not something I wanted to preserve behind glass. It was something I wanted to wear thin from use. Because sometimes, the weight of a life is not stored in the body, or in the house, or even in the voice. Sometimes it's carried in the way a pen moves across paper, in the spaces between words, in the knowledge that someone loved you enough to leave behind something you didn't know you'd need. That letter became my prayer, not because it spoke to a God, but because it remembered me better than I remembered myself. The living room had always been the center of the house, not because of its size or decor, but because of the table. It wasn't a particularly elegant piece, certainly nothing a furniture collector would have admired, but it had weight, not just physical weight, though it was solid oak and scratched in 100 places. Its true gravity came from history. That table had held birthday cakes, tax folders, board games, coffee rings, newspaper crossword puzzles, and in the final months of Marlene's life, her hands. I spent that morning wiping it down, not because it was dusty, but because it felt like something I could still do. The cloth moved in slow circles across the wood, tracing old watermarks and the shallow grooves from a knife she once used to open a stubborn box. I didn't want to polish it. I didn't want to erase those marks. I wanted them exactly where they were, like fingerprints no one else could see. The table had 4 legs, one of which had been repaired 3 times. I remembered each instance. The first was after David leaned too hard against it during a tantrum at age 9. The second came after I dropped a toolbox while installing a new light fixture. The third happened when Marlene tripped on her robe and braced herself against the edge to stop from falling. That was the moment I knew she had started to get weaker, though neither of us said it aloud. I sat at the head of the table, my usual spot. I hadn't sat there since the funeral. Something about returning to it felt too ceremonial, like I was taking a position I no longer had the right to occupy. But that morning, with the sun coming in through the east-facing windows, I pulled out the chair and lowered myself into it, listening to the creak of the wood and the shift of old fabric beneath me. The house held its breath around me. The box of letters I had found in her dresser sat near the edge of the table, next to a cold mug of tea I had brewed but forgotten to drink. A notepad with her handwriting rested beside it. Just a grocery list, the top item faded. Cinnamon sticks. She always liked to keep them in a jar on the windowsill, even when she didn't plan to use them. Said the smell reminded her of her grandmother's kitchen. I opened the box and took out 1 letter at random. I didn't read it right away. I placed it flat on the table and just looked at it. The envelope was slightly worn at the corners, her handwriting still sharp. It amazed me how steady it had stayed even after the illness had begun to affect her memory. Her penmanship never wavered. She could forget what day it was, but she never forgot how to shape a G. As I finally opened the envelope, the table became something else, an altar almost. Not in a religious sense, but in the way certain places become sacred, because of what they've held. I unfolded the letter, and her voice filled the room again, not out loud, but in my chest. She wrote about a morning we spent in the backyard, planting tulip bulbs, how we disagreed over where the sun would hit in spring. She'd been right, of course. She always was when it came to the garden. She ended the letter by asking me to water the bulbs. Not because they'll bloom, but because they remember your hands. I folded the paper and pressed my palm against it, feeling the raised texture of her writing. I sat like that for several minutes. The house made no sound. The furnace had cycled off. The fridge had settled. Outside, I saw a squirrel perched on the railing, sniffing the air like it too remembered something. I reached over and opened the small drawer built into the side of the table. Inside was a deck of playing cards, 2 mismatched pens, a dried-out glue stick, and a crumpled envelope addressed to us both, Mr. and Mrs. Hayden. The return address had faded, but I knew it was from a niece who now lived in Oregon. She had sent a photo of her baby. Marlene had kept the photo in the drawer, along with a note that read, "New things still begin." I unfolded the note and placed it beside the letter. I began to arrange small pieces of our life across the tabletop. Her list, the note, the photograph, one of her scarves. It wasn't planned. It wasn't for anyone to see. It was just for me, for her, for the table that had supported every version of us. There were places at the table that still held the pressure of her elbows, a slight discoloration where she always set her cup, a notch in the wood from a dropped spoon. These things don't show up in photographs. They don't get passed down in wills. They only live in the fingertips of those who remember. I thought about the last meal we shared at that table. It was simple, tomato soup and grilled cheese, which we made together because neither of us had the energy for more. She had laughed when I burned one side of the sandwich and called it extra flavor. Her appetite was small that day, but her smile stayed. She dabbed at her lips with a napkin and said, "We've eaten like kings and paupers at this table, but we always ate together." That memory rose in me like a tide. I stood slowly and walked to the kitchen. From the cabinet, I took out the last of the cinnamon sticks she had saved. I placed one on a small dish at the center of the table. The scent was faint, but real. I sat again and closed my eyes. For a moment, I could feel her there, opposite me, legs crossed at the ankle, fingers curled around a cup. I didn't speak aloud. I didn't need to. Later, as the light shifted and shadows stretched across the floor, I took out a pen and opened my own notebook. I began to write. Not a letter, not a list, just words. Things I remembered. Her favorite mug. The way she always turned her pillow twice before sleeping. The sound she made when tasting something too hot. I wrote until the page filled. Then I closed the notebook and placed it beside hers. 2 notebooks, 2 sets of handwriting, 1 table, and a quiet, unshakable truth that settled deep in my bones. That love, real love, leaves a weight that can't be measured. Not in carats, not in dollars, not even in years. Only in the way a table holds its stories long after the people have gone. And I would be the one to keep it. The morning began like most of the others had that month. Quiet, gray, and without interruption. The clock in the hallway struck 7 with its usual hollow chime, and I sat up in bed, not because I wanted to, but because lying still any longer made the emptiness settle too deeply in my chest. I slid my feet into my slippers, stood slowly, and stared at the room that was now only mine. I didn't make the bed. I never did when I knew I wouldn't have anyone checking behind me. The room didn't ask to be perfect anymore. It only asked to be lived in, even if halfway. The coffee maker clicked on with the timer, a habit I had kept for years, even though I often forgot I had set it. The scent of brewing grounds drifted into the hallway, faint and bitter. I poured 1 cup, filled it only halfway, and took it to the living room. The house still felt cold, despite the heater humming through the vents. I sat in my usual chair and looked across the room to where Marlene's box rested on the dining table, still unopened since David had placed it there days earlier. The jewelry box had become something of a totem, its presence anchoring a part of me I wasn't ready to face. The fact that it was back in plain sight, after being handled by someone who saw its contents as currency instead of memory, made it harder to approach. It wasn't about the rings or the necklaces anymore. It was about what remained mine, what I could choose to protect, what I might still have the right to keep. I had been circling a decision for days. David hadn't pushed since that visit, but I could sense it in his voice on the phone. He was waiting for me to tell him I'd gone through it all, that I'd made a pile of things that could help the family, that I'd reached the same conclusion he had the moment he asked if the box was still in the bedroom. He hadn't asked out of sentiment. He had asked out of assumption. I walked to the table and ran my hand over the top of the box. The velvet had worn down over the years into a smooth, shiny surface, almost like leather in places. It no longer felt luxurious, just used, familiar. I opened the lid slowly and looked down at the tangled chains, loose earrings, and small velvet-lined slots that once held her favorite pieces, now empty or disturbed. The items were still there, but they no longer sat with intention. They had been moved, handled, judged. I lifted out her wedding ring. It was smaller than I remembered. She had always said it felt heavier than it looked, that love sometimes carried weight in unexpected ways. I turned it over in my palm. The inscription inside was still there, faded but readable. Our initials, the date, nothing poetic, just fact, time branded in gold. Next to the ring was the necklace I gave her for our 35th anniversary. It had taken me months to save for it, and I remembered how my hands trembled when I fastened it around her neck. She wore it only twice, afraid of losing it. "Some things are too lovely for every day," she had said, but she kept it close, wrapped in a handkerchief in the back of her dresser drawer. I had only found it after she passed, tucked between sweaters she never wore in spring. I sat down at the table and spread out the contents, one by one. Not to sort them, but to see them. Each item had a memory attached to it, not just when it was given, but how it was worn. The bracelet she wore to our son's graduation, the brooch shaped like a leaf she always pinned to her coat in the fall, the mismatched earrings she stubbornly kept wearing even after losing the pair. David had asked me to make decisions. He had said it casually, almost like he didn't want to put pressure on me. "If there's anything you don't want to keep," he'd said. But I knew what he meant. He wanted me to open a door, to let him in, to divide what she had left behind into manageable pieces. But memory doesn't divide cleanly. I picked up one ring, the smallest of them all, and turned it in my fingers. It had a small stone, barely noticeable, and I remembered giving it to her after our first argument as a married couple. I had brought it home not to apologize, but to remind her that choosing her had always been the right thing. She had worn it on her right hand for decades. There was a folded note at the bottom of the box. I didn't remember seeing it before. It was written on one of her note cards, the kind she used for birthdays and grocery lists. She had written only one sentence. "Not everything that glitters belongs to everyone." I read it 3 times, then folded it back and returned it to its place. I knew then that the choice was mine. No one would blame me for giving David some of these things. No one would call me unkind. But I also knew that the choice wasn't about fairness. It was about preservation, not of wealth, but of weight, of the gravity these objects held when they were still warmed by her skin, of the way they carried her shape, her smell, her quiet preferences. I closed the box and placed my hand on the lid. I sat that way for a long while, the morning slipping into early afternoon without notice. The coffee had gone cold. The house remained still. I wasn't waiting for a sign. I was simply deciding. Slowly. Deliberately. The way you decide where to bury something meaningful, not to hide it, but to keep it sacred. Later that evening, I placed a small lock on the jewelry box. It wasn't a matter of security. It was a gesture, a way of saying this part of her story wouldn't be shared in pieces. It would remain whole, whether David understood or not. I took the box to the attic, not to forget it, but to place it somewhere quiet, above the noise of daily life. I set it on a high shelf beside a box of our wedding photos and the guest book from our 40th anniversary. I walked downstairs and sat again at the table. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel cruel. I felt tired, but I also felt sure. The choice had been mine to make, and I had made it not with resentment, but with reverence. Because love, in the end, is not what you give away. It's what you choose to keep whole. The house had always known more than it said. It had listened through every silence, watched through every season, and held on to things long after we had let them go. It wasn't the kind of house that boasted with architecture or drew attention with grandeur. It was modest, square-shouldered, and unassuming. A single-story ranch in a quiet Ohio neighborhood where mailboxes leaned slightly and lawns told the truth about their owners. But beneath its simple frame, it had always carried more than wood and drywall. After Marlene passed, I started noticing it. Not in the way people talk about ghosts or superstitions. Nothing moved on its own. No cold spots. No creaks that couldn't be explained. What I noticed was quieter than that. More subtle. A kind of awareness. A presence that didn't demand attention but couldn't be ignored either. It lived in corners, in the soft hum of the furnace, in the echo of footsteps on the kitchen tile when no one else was home. The house didn't mourn with me. It remembered beside me. It began one afternoon when I decided to clean the back bedroom. We had used it for storage in recent years. After David moved out, we turned it into a catch-all space. Holiday decorations, old books, the treadmill Marlene never used but refused to sell. The door had remained closed since the funeral. I had avoided it without meaning to. But that day, I felt pulled there by something I couldn't quite name. The air was cooler inside, stale but not unpleasant. Dust floated in slow spirals through the window light, and the carpet beneath my feet gave off the faint scent of time. I opened the closet first, expecting the usual boxes and forgotten coats. What I didn't expect was the suitcase. It was one I hadn't seen in years. Brown leather with a faded airline tag still looped through the handle. I knelt down and pulled it forward. The zipper stuck at first, then gave way with a dry rasp. Inside, I found papers, folders, envelopes, notebooks. Not bank records or tax returns, but personal things. Things Marlene had kept without telling me. There was a folder labeled simply, Letters. Inside were dozens of envelopes, all addressed to people I recognized. Her sister, a childhood friend, an old neighbor who'd moved to Florida. Each one had been opened and read, then carefully folded and kept. Responses, it seemed, to letters she had sent years ago. But she had never told me she was writing anyone. And I never asked. That was the kind of marriage we had, built on presence more than confession. Beside the folder was a stack of journals, spiral-bound, some with bent covers and watermarks, others pristine. I picked one up and flipped through it. Her handwriting was everywhere. Her thoughts, her fears, her dreams. She had written about the garden, about growing old, about the silence between us that sometimes grew too wide to cross. She hadn't written with bitterness, just observation. The kind of clarity that comes only when you think no one will ever read it. She had kept a journal for over 20 years. I had lived beside her, eaten meals across from her, fallen asleep next to her body every night. And I never knew. But the house had known. It had carried those books, protected them, let them rest under insulation and forgotten linens, and it had waited until the right moment to reveal them. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened another journal. This one was older. Her words were younger. She wrote about David as a toddler, about fears of motherhood, about me, my habits, my silences, my way of loving that sometimes looked like absence to her. She had worried she wasn't enough, worried she was too much, wondered who she would be when the world stopped asking her to take care of everyone else. She wrote about the house. She said it had moods, that it breathed differently in the winter, that it listened at night, that when she stood in the hallway, she sometimes felt it remember things before she could. She called it a gentle keeper, and she thanked it for its patience. I set the journal down and looked around the room. The walls didn't speak, the ceiling didn't shift, but I felt it, the density of the space, the way the air settled around me like arms. The house had known who she really was, and it had kept her safe, not from time, not from illness, but from vanishing. In the bottom of the suitcase, beneath a folded sweater and a dried rose, I found a small cassette tape. It had no label, no case, just a black reel inside a cracked plastic shell. I didn't recognize it. I brought it to the old stereo in the den, the one we hadn't used in over a decade. I plugged it in, wiped the dust from the play button, and slid the tape into the slot. There was a click, a pause, then a voice. Her voice. She was singing, not to anyone, not with an audience, just humming softly to herself, then slowly rising into lyrics. An old hymn, one she used to hum while folding laundry. Her voice was thin, not polished, but steady, full of breath and warmth. She sang only one verse, then stopped. I waited. The tape hissed, then her voice again. "Walter," she said. Nothing else. Just my name. A pause after it, like a breath before a thought. Then silence. The tape ran for another 3 minutes, full of soft ambient nothing. Then it clicked off. I didn't rewind it. I didn't play it again. I sat on the couch, her name still in the air, and I let the house hold the rest. That night, I didn't turn on the lights. I walked through each room, letting the dark press against me. I touched the backs of chairs, the tops of door frames, the wooden railing of the stairs. Every surface held her in some small way. The indentation of her hands, the memory of her steps, the echo of her breath. The house had never been just wood and paint. It had always been her companion. And now it was mine, not because it comforted me, but because it remembered better than I did, and because somewhere behind the drywall and the wiring, it still carried her voice. Quiet, steady, waiting, just like it always had. I always thought the hardest part of grief was the moment of loss itself, the breath that doesn't come, the empty bed, the silence after a final heartbeat. But I was wrong. What I hadn't accounted for was what came next. The erosion, the slow wearing away of things not by memory, but by repetition. The realization that the world insists on continuing, even when you don't. That time, indifferent and efficient, peels her from every surface. And worse still, that you begin helping it do so, out of fatigue, or confusion, or necessity. It started with the magazines. She kept a stack by the armchair in the living room, most of them months old, dog-eared at recipes she meant to try or articles she never finished reading. For weeks, I walked past them like sacred texts, afraid to disturb their order. But one day, without thinking, I picked up the top one and carried it to the recycling bin. I stood over it, staring into the mouth of the container, flipping through pages that still held the scent of her hand lotion. And then, I let it fall. Just like that. One thin volume of her vanished. I wish I could say I cried afterward, that I mourned the loss of that magazine as a symbol of something larger. But I didn't. I made a sandwich, washed the dish, and moved on to the next thing. That's how it begins, not with ceremony, but with the ordinary. The next week, I folded the laundry and put away her sweaters. Not all of them, just the ones I no longer recognized. There were pieces she hadn't worn in years, colors she stopped liking, fabrics that no longer matched the woman she had been near the end. I folded them quietly, almost methodically, like a man performing inventory. I didn't press my face into them. I didn't whisper apologies. I just stacked them in a donation bag and set it by the door. David came by 2 days later. He didn't stay long. He brought over some paperwork, said he'd scheduled a meeting with the attorney, and asked if I'd thought any more about what I wanted to do with the house. That was the phrase he used. Do with it, as if it were a problem to be solved, a piece of property rather than the very shell of my history. I told him I hadn't decided. He nodded, said he understood, but I could see in his eyes that he was already picturing paint swatches, moving trucks, equity. He didn't notice the bag of sweaters by the door, or if he did, he didn't ask. After he left, I moved through the house and began opening drawers, not to sort or clean, just to look, to see what remained. Toothpicks in a paper box from the diner we used to go to after doctor's appointments. A notepad with 3 items written in her handwriting: milk, light bulbs, extra batteries. A spool of thread she never found a needle for. A grocery store receipt from last December with a star drawn next to clementines. I closed the drawers without removing anything. I wanted them to stay like that. Small altars, quiet echoes. Then I opened the closet. It still smelled like her. Fainter now, diluted by time, dust, the dry pull of unused air. Her jackets hung like question marks. Shoes still lined up neatly, the left ones always slightly ahead of the right. I slid the door open wider and stepped inside. I didn't touch anything. I just stood there, trying to remember what it felt like to hear her talking from another room, muffled through layers of fabric and distance. A week later, I boxed up the shoes. Not the jackets, not yet, but the shoes. I picked them up one by one, held them as though expecting warmth, and placed them in a cardboard box I sealed with 2 strips of tape. I didn't label it. I just wrote W on the side, without knowing why. That same evening, I made a list of everything I hadn't told her. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe guilt, maybe fear, maybe I believed that naming the things would return some of the weight to them. I wrote them on a legal pad. Everything from, I wish I had taken you to the beach more often, to, you were right about the neighbor's dog. Some were petty, some were tender, some made my hands tremble. I didn't read the list back. I folded it, placed it in the back of the silverware drawer, and closed it gently. The days blurred again after that. Mail came. Bills arrived. The seasons inched forward. The hydrangeas out front bloomed and withered. I trimmed them without comment. Neighbors waved. I waved back. No one asked if I was okay anymore, and I stopped pretending I was. One night, just before the first frost, I sat in the garage with the lights off. There were boxes stacked around me. Christmas decorations, photo albums, her college textbooks she had refused to part with. I sat on a folding chair, wrapped in a blanket she used to keep in the car. The smell of motor oil and pine cleaner mixed into something oddly nostalgic. I let my eyes close, not to sleep, but to float. In that space, I realized something that had been circling me for weeks. She was leaving, not in spirit, not in memory, but in trace. Her presence was dissolving, not because I wanted it to, but because that's what time does. It chips, it scrapes, it softens. I had always thought I'd fight it tooth and nail, that I'd build a shrine to her and keep it untouched. But in reality, I had already started letting go, inch by inch, sock by sock, napkin by napkin. The idea didn't break me. It humbled me. To love someone deeply is to lose them 1,000 times. In meals you eat alone, in the bed that holds only your imprint, in the silence that used to be shared. That week, I made one final decision. I took down the calendar from the hallway. It was still set to the month she died. I flipped it forward, not to today, but to a blank month, a future. I didn't write anything on it. I just let it hang there, waiting. The house stayed still. It had held her, and now it held only me. And I realized I wasn't looking for her anymore in the rooms. I was carrying her, quietly, without display, without a trace left behind. Because when someone becomes part of you, their departure stops being something you can see. It becomes something you carry with your breath, with your gait, with your smallest rituals. And in that way, she had never truly left. She had simply walked deeper into me, where no one else could follow. The day David returned, the house was quiet, in a way that felt staged. It wasn't the natural hush of an early morning or the gentle stillness after dusk. It was the silence that comes before something unwanted, the kind that feels too orderly, too deliberate, like the air itself had agreed to stay out of the way. I had known he would come eventually, not because he missed me, not even because he missed her, but because he believed there was still something left for him to collect. I saw his car pull into the driveway around noon. He didn't honk. He didn't call ahead. He stepped out, straightened his coat, and looked at the house as if it were something to be evaluated. The same way people look at listings online: square footage, roof line, curb appeal. I watched from the window, standing slightly behind the curtain. He hesitated for a moment before walking up the front steps. Then the doorbell rang. I didn't rush to open it. I let it ring twice. When I finally did answer, I stepped aside wordlessly and let him enter. He walked in with a familiar energy, the same walk he had when he was 10 and wanted to ask for money. I could see it in the way his shoulders moved, a mix of assumed authority and practiced restraint. He took off his shoes. He always had that habit. I never asked him to. Marlene did. And even now, even after everything, he obeyed that rule. That detail softened something in me for a brief moment until he spoke. He asked if I'd made any progress. I said nothing. He gestured toward the dining room. The jewelry box was gone now. So were the photos. So was the scarf. The table was bare, save for the sunlight stretching across it like a reminder that time kept going, no matter what we filled the hours with. He looked confused for a second, like he'd lost his place in a script. Then he adjusted, smiled politely, and asked if I had set anything aside. I told him I had. He waited for me to move, to retrieve it. But I didn't. I stood in the center of the living room with my hands folded behind my back. The silence between us grew thicker, not hostile, but full. Like a full cup, trembling, but unspilled. He asked again, this time with a hint of impatience. I said nothing. I simply walked to the hallway, opened the door to the study, and pointed. Inside, on the desk, was a single envelope. Sealed. No name written on it. Just a plain white envelope, placed square in the middle of the oak surface. He walked past me, reached for it, and paused before picking it up. He looked at me once, as if waiting for confirmation. I gave none. He opened the envelope. Inside was a copy of the revised will. He read quickly, his eyes scanning for numbers, for names, for titles. His brow furrowed. He read it again, slower this time. Then his shoulders slumped. He asked me what this meant. I told him it meant exactly what it said, that the house, the accounts, the boxes in the attic, the furniture, the land. It was no longer his concern. I had donated the estate. Quietly. Months ago. Everything was being transferred to a veterans fund, a library foundation, and a local hospice center that had once held Marlene's mother in her final weeks. Nothing remained to be split. Nothing left to dispute. What had once been ours had now become something else. He stood very still. Then he asked why. I didn't answer. He raised his voice, not loud, but sharp. He said he thought we were family, that she would have wanted something to go to him, that I was being unfair. I let the words come. I didn't interrupt him. I let him speak all the way to the end of his sentence, to the end of his breath. Then I walked past him and sat at the kitchen table. The same table where she had held his hand during storms, where she had written him birthday cards he never opened, where she had once waited 2 hours for him to come to dinner, and never mentioned it again. I sat there, and placed both palms on the surface, feeling the slight rise of old stains, the memory in the wood grain. The table knew more than either of us. He stood in the doorway for a while. I could feel him there, his presence buzzing like a loose wire. He wanted to yell, or leave, or throw something. But he did none of those things. He turned, picked up the envelope, and left without another word. I didn't watch him go. I stayed at the table until the sun moved across the window pane and painted shadows on the linoleum. I sat in the silence that followed, a silence different from before. This silence had weight, finality, peace. I rose, walked to the front door, and closed it gently. Then I locked it. Not out of spite, not out of fear, but because that chapter was closed. The next morning, I took the key to the jewelry box and placed it inside a ceramic bowl on the shelf by the fireplace. I placed Marlene's old reading glasses beside it. I dusted the mantel. I opened the windows. And then, for the first time in months, I turned on the radio. Soft music filled the house. No lyrics, just a low hum of notes, rising, falling, patient. The kind of sound that fills a room without asking for attention. The walls breathed. The chairs waited. The air moved again. And I sat quietly in the middle of it all, no longer carrying the burden of unfinished things, no longer waiting to be asked, no longer explaining. There was nothing left to argue, only the silence of inheritance, not the kind measured in assets, but the kind that lives in how a man chooses to remember, and how he chooses to let go.